I remember it so clearly, her gaze. It wasn't intentional at first, but it was impossible to ignore. I was sitting in my usual spot near the back, trying to keep my focus on the lesson, but my mind kept drifting. It wasn't just the lecture or the usual distractions of the class. It was her. She had been standing at the front of the room, writing on the board, explaining something with her usual composure. But this time, when I glanced up, I caught her looking back at me. It was brief, just a momentary flicker, but it was enough. There was something in her eyes, something that felt like an unspoken connection, a tension that hadn't been there before. Her expression was calm, professional, but her eyes held something more. They lingered just a second too long, and I could feel it, the shift in the air between us. It wasn't the usual glance from a teacher to a student. There was softness in the way she looked at me, a vulnerability hidden behind her typically stern demeanor. I had always admired her, respected her for her knowledge, her grace, but I had never seen her this way, this human, this real. For a moment, everything else in the room faded away. The other students, the noise, the ticking of the clock. None of it mattered. All I could focus on was her. Her dark eyes, full of depth, locked onto mine with an intensity one hadn't expected. It was as though she was silently acknowledging something we both knew but had never spoken about. I quickly looked down at my desk, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I imagining it? Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary look. There was something more there. Something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. The rest of the class passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on the lesson. My thoughts kept circling back to that moment, that glance. I wondered if she knew what it did to me, how it left me unsettled, yet somehow longing for more. At the end of class, I stood up, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. I was gathering my things when I caught her looking at me again, this time from across the room. But this time it wasn't the same lingering gaze. This time there was something else, something unreadable in her eyes. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew I had to find out. I walked out of the classroom, my heart still racing, my mind tangled in confusion and curiosity. That glance, just a moment, but it had already changed everything. And I couldn't help but wonder, was she feeling the same way, or was I just imagining things? The days that followed were different. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that the look from her earlier was just a fleeting moment, something I had read too much into. But as the days wore on, the tension between us became more palpable, more undeniable. It wasn't just in the way she would glance at me from across the room. It was in the little things, the subtle shifts in the air between us, the unspoken exchange of energy that seemed to build with every class. She was always poised, professional, and collected, as if she had mastered the art of maintaining a perfect distance from her students. But now, when I walked into the classroom, there was a slight shift in her demeanor. Her gaze would often find mine, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary, before quickly darting away as though she realized what she had done. It wasn't the usual glance of a teacher checking if a student was paying attention. It was something more, and every time our eyes met, my heart would skip a beat, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just the looks. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible change in the way she interacted with me. Her tone when she addressed me was softer, more considerate, and at times, I could swear I heard a hint of something warmer beneath the surface. When she'd hand back assignments, her fingers would brush against mine, just a fleeting touch that felt like it burned through my skin. Each time, it felt like the world around us disappeared for just a second, leaving only the two of us in this strange, unspoken moment. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the lesson and the assignments, but it was impossible. Her presence consumed me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I found myself looking for any excuse to be near her, to hear her voice, to feel that energy between us. It was a silent, magnetic pull, and I couldn't resist it. One afternoon, as the class was wrapping up, I lingered behind, pretending to review my notes, but really, I was just waiting. I wasn't sure for what. I guess I was hoping for another glance, Another moment where our worlds collided in that brief, inexplicable way. The other students filed out, and soon it was just the two of us, the silence between us thick with the tension that had built over the past few days. She walked past me to gather her things, and as she did, I felt the faintest brush of her hand against mine. It was nothing intentional, but it was enough to send a surge of warmth rushing through me. I looked up quickly, meeting her eyes, and for a moment we both froze. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, a flicker of something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. It was as though she had been waiting for me to make the next move, but I wasn't sure what that move should be. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an undertone that made my stomach tighten. "You seem a little distracted today." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "Just tired?" I muttered, but my voice betrayed me. There was something more there, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. She didn't push further, but her smile lingered longer than usual, and for the briefest moment, I could swear I saw a glimmer of something in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity and something I couldn't understand. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and she turned to leave. But before she did, she glanced back at me one last time. It was a look filled with warmth and something else, something that made my heart race. And in that moment, I knew whatever this was between us, it was no accident. We were both aware of it. The tension was no longer unspoken. It was acknowledged, shared, and neither of us knew what to do next. But one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore it anymore, and neither could she. The following week, the tension between us continued to build, each interaction pulling us closer to something neither of us had expected. It felt like a secret we were both trying to keep, something we didn't have words for but couldn't ignore. There was a certain weight in the air whenever I walked into the classroom, a charged atmosphere that wasn't there before. And no matter how much I tried to focus on the lessons, I found myself looking for her eyes, waiting for the briefest glance, that silent acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. But it was after class one afternoon that everything changed. The last bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Students filed out of the room, talking amongst themselves, gathering their bags, already lost in the rush of the day's end. But I didn't move. I stayed at my desk, pretending to sort through some papers, my heart pounding a little faster than usual. I didn't know why I stayed behind. Part of me wanted to talk to her, to clear the air, but another part was terrified of what might happen if I did. I kept my eyes on my desk, hoping that if I looked busy enough, maybe I could avoid whatever awkwardness might follow. But the silence between us grew, thick and uncomfortable. Then I heard her voice. "You're still here." I looked up quickly, startled by the softness in her tone. She stood near her desk, gathering her things in a deliberate, unhurried way. Her movements were calm, practiced, yet there was something different about this moment. She wasn't rushing to leave like she normally did. She was lingering too, as if she, too, was trying to figure out what was happening between us. "Yeah," I replied, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "I guess I just needed to catch up on some work." Her eyes softened as she walked over to me, her gaze lingering just a bit too long, that familiar pull between us unmistakable. She stopped beside my desk, her presence filling the small space in a way that felt both comforting and nerve-wracking at the same time. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice low and gentle. But there was something else there. Something that told me she knew I wasn't just distracted by schoolwork. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Was it really okay? How could I explain the strange mix of emotions I was feeling? The pull I couldn't escape. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever. Her eyes were soft, with the faintest trace of concern. But there was also something else. A depth, a vulnerability that I hadn't noticed before. The air between us was thick, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. "I'm not sure," I admitted finally, my voice barely a whisper. "There's just something, I don't know." Her gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, I thought I saw her breath catch, just slightly. She stepped a little closer, her hand reaching out to touch the edge of my desk, her fingers hovering above the surface. It wasn't a touch, not really, but the mere proximity of her hand, so close to mine, sent a ripple of warmth through me. She smiled then, but it wasn't the professional smile she usually wore in class. It was softer, more genuine, and it made my heart race. "You're not the only one who feels that way," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to me. Her words hit me like a wave. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between us, a recognition that neither of us had dared to voice before. But now, with her standing there, so close, the distance between us felt smaller, less insurmountable. I could feel the heat of her body, the quiet rhythm of her breath as she stood beside me. And though no words were exchanged, everything we both felt hung in the air, between us, unspoken but understood. "I think I should go," she said, finally breaking the silence, though she still didn't move. She lingered for a moment longer, and then, with one final, meaningful glance, she turned and walked toward the door. I watched her leave, the ache in my chest growing with every step she took away from me. But as she reached the door, she paused and glanced back. Her smile was fleeting, but it held a weight of something deeper, something unresolved. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice soft, carrying a note of finality. And just like that, the door closed behind her, leaving me alone with the rush of emotions that I hadn't known how to process. The room was quieter now, but it felt heavier. What had just happened? Had we crossed a line? And what was this feeling, this growing connection between us, that neither of us had the courage to put into words? I wasn't sure what to make of it, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The days after that quiet moment were filled with an electric undercurrent I couldn't shake. The atmosphere between us had shifted, and every interaction seemed to hold more weight than before. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance, every word spoken, every tiny movement she made. It wasn't just about the lessons anymore. It was about the space between us, and the silence that held so much unspoken meaning. Then, one day it happened. The kind of moment that seemed insignificant at first but would forever change everything. The class was nearing its end, and as usual, students were beginning to pack up their things. The noise of bags zipping and chairs scraping against the floor filled the room, but my attention was completely fixed on her. I tried not to let it show, tried to act like everything was normal, but I was aware of every small detail. I could feel her presence even when she wasn't looking at me. There was an intensity in the air, a quiet charge I couldn't explain. I stood up from my desk, gathering my things slowly, but I wasn't in any real rush. I couldn't bring myself to leave yet. I found myself waiting, unsure of what exactly I was hoping for. And then, as if on cue, she walked toward me, holding a stack of papers she had just finished grading. Her steps were measured, confident, and yet there was something different about this moment. She seemed more relaxed, less guarded. She stopped in front of my desk, and for the briefest moment, we locked eyes. The world outside of that classroom faded into the background, and all I could see was her. The way her hair fell softly around her face, the way her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Without saying a word, she handed me the graded paper with a quiet "Here you go." Her fingers brushed against mine as she passed the paper to me, and the sensation was electric. It was just a small touch, almost accidental, but it felt like it lasted far longer than it should have. Her skin was warm, and the brief contact sent a shiver down my spine. I could see the faint blush on her cheeks, and I knew, without needing to ask, that she had felt it too. That tiny moment, that small gesture, seemed to contain everything that was building between us. The curiosity, the uncertainty, the quiet, growing desire. I glanced down at the paper she had given me, though I wasn't really looking at it. My thoughts were elsewhere, tangled up in that fleeting connection. When I looked up again, she was still standing there, waiting. I wasn't sure if she was going to say anything more, but I could feel her hesitation, her uncertainty. The room around us seemed to blur, and all I could focus on was her. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice almost hoarse as I tried to steady myself. I wasn't sure if she could hear the way my heart was racing in my chest. She gave me another small, quiet smile. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice gentle. There was a softness in the way she said it, a tenderness that wasn't there before. She didn't rush to walk away, and neither did I. We stood there for a moment, the space between us charged, heavy with something neither of us had yet dared to name. The moment passed quickly, though it felt like it had lasted an eternity. She gave me one last look before turning to leave, but this time, there was something different in her gaze. It was warm, but there was an underlying sadness too, as if she was holding something back. She walked away, but I couldn't take my eyes off her as she moved toward the door. The small gesture of handing me the paper, such an ordinary, everyday action, had suddenly become the most intimate moment of our entire relationship. I had never noticed how something so small could carry so much weight. But now, every time I saw her, every time our hands brushed by accident, it felt like the world had changed. I lingered in the classroom long after she left, my mind racing with the possibilities of what this all meant. That tiny touch, that simple gesture, did it mean something more? Was it just a fleeting moment? Or was this the beginning of something that neither of us could escape? All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. And this time, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. It was one of those afternoons when the sunlight was softer, the shadows longer, and the classroom felt quieter than usual. The students filed out, as they always did, in the rush to escape the last bell of the day. I, however, stayed behind, unusually still, uncertain of my next move. The tension between us had built to a point where every word, every glance felt more charged than it ever had before. But what made this moment different was the vulnerability that hung in the air. I wasn't sure what to expect, but somehow I knew she'd notice I hadn't left yet. I could feel her gaze before I even looked up. She was standing near the chalkboard, running her hands over the notes she'd written earlier in class, as though organizing her thoughts or simply stalling before heading to her next task. But this time she didn't rush. She didn't act like the teacher who had a strict schedule to keep. She seemed as if she was allowing herself a moment too, waiting, maybe, for something. I was aware of the way the room felt, a little warmer than usual, the dim glow of the late afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. It was quiet in that way only classrooms can be after everyone has gone. A sense of stillness hanging in the air, broken only by the quiet hum of the lights above. Finally, I looked up, catching her gaze. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She had already known I wasn't leaving yet, and I had known she hadn't forgotten me. Our eyes met, and I could see it clearly now. She wasn't hiding it anymore. The wariness, the walls she'd always maintained between us, had cracked. In her gaze, there was something fragile, an openness that felt like an invitation. The barrier she had so carefully built was beginning to falter, and I could sense that she, too, was unsure of what to do with the feelings that were now so visible. Her voice broke the silence, softer than I had ever heard it. "I'm glad you stayed." The words were simple, but they felt like an acknowledgement of everything that had been building between us. The quiet moments, the stolen glances, the unspoken desire. The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard, making my chest tighten. It wasn't the voice of a teacher giving a lesson or offering guidance. It was the voice of someone who had been struggling with something for a long time and, for the first time, was willing to admit it. "I wasn't sure if I should," I admitted quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were nervously clutching the edge of my desk, but I didn't look away. There was something in her that made me feel like I could speak freely, even if I didn't have all the answers myself. She let out a soft sigh, her eyes dropping to the floor for just a moment, and then she stepped closer to me. Her presence seemed to fill the room, and the distance between us felt smaller than it ever had before. I could feel my heart racing, but somehow, the closeness didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right. She paused beside my desk, her fingers brushing the edge of my notebook. It was such a small gesture, but it held a weight to it, like it was something unspoken but deeply meaningful. "You're not the only one feeling this," she said, her voice shaking just slightly. "I can't explain it, but I can't ignore it anymore." I felt a warmth spread through me at her words, though I knew there was still a distance between us, both physical and emotional. that we hadn't yet crossed. But for the first time, it felt like the wall she had built was coming down. The fear, the uncertainty, the professional distance that had kept us apart, all seemed to fade in that moment. There was something real between us now, something undeniable. The air around us seemed to hum with the weight of her confession, but I could sense she was holding back. She wanted to say more, but there was a hesitation there, as though she feared what it might mean if she fully let go. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say either. I had never been in a situation like this before. How do you speak to someone who is both a teacher and a person you're beginning to feel a powerful connection with? Instead of speaking, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out, slowly, carefully, and placed my hand on the corner of the desk, just an inch from hers. It wasn't a touch, not yet, but it was a gesture, a silent offer. And when she looked at me, that flicker of understanding passed between us again, like a quiet promise. She looked down at our hands, and then back into my eyes, her breath catching in her throat. But before either of us could say anything more, the bell rang. The moment was broken, and the world outside the classroom seemed to rush back in, pulling us away from what was beginning to unfold between us. As she walked toward the door, she turned to look at me one last time. "We'll talk more later," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite define. And then she was gone. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy with uncertainty anymore. Instead, it was filled with the quiet promise of what might come next. And I knew for the first time that neither of us could pretend anymore. Something real was happening between us, and we were both beginning to let go of the fear that had kept us apart. It had been a week since that moment. A week of restless thoughts and stolen glances, of an undercurrent of something unspoken growing more tangible with each passing day. I hadn't seen her since that afternoon, and I had spent every moment trying to read between the lines of her actions, trying to make sense of the vulnerability I had seen in her eyes. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't something I could figure out on my own. I needed answers, answers I wasn't sure I was ready for, but answers I couldn't ignore any longer. That day, the tension felt different. The air in the classroom was thick, more charged than usual. It wasn't just her presence that weighed on me. It was the silence that hung between us, a silence filled with everything we had left unspoken. I could feel it in the way she moved, in the way her eyes seemed to linger on mine for just a second too long. Her demeanor had changed too. No longer the controlled, distant teacher I had always known, but someone else, someone who had started to let down her guard, at least in small moments. I couldn't wait any longer. It felt like a pressure building up inside of me, something I couldn't push away anymore. After the bell rang, signaling the end of class, I stood up without thinking, walking toward her desk with a determination I hadn't known I was capable of. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable but soft. There was that same vulnerability in her eyes, the same softness that made my heart race. I could tell she was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to take the first step, but I wasn't sure what to say. I had never been in a situation like this before. I had never felt so much, so deeply, and yet had no idea how to put it into words. "Can we talk?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Her eyes widened for a moment, and I could see the hesitation in her expression. She glanced around the empty classroom, as if checking to make sure we were alone. When her eyes met mine again, they were filled with something. Anxiety, uncertainty, but also curiosity, as though she was wondering what I was going to say. "Of course," she said quietly, her voice soft and calm, though I could sense her heart racing, just as mine was. I led the way to the corner of the room, away from the door, away from the eyes of any lingering students. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us deafening. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was the kind of silence that held everything, all the words we hadn't said yet. Finally, I spoke, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I can't stop thinking about you," I confessed, my voice low but steady. "I don't know why, and I don't know what this is, but I can't ignore it anymore." There was a pause, and I could see her breath catch in her throat. Her eyes searched mine, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. I felt a mixture of fear and relief. I had said it, finally put the weight of my feelings out into the open, but now I was terrified of what might come next. She started, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath, her hands folding together in front of her as if gathering strength. I didn't want this. I didn't want to feel this way, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do. I can't pretend that I don't. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was a storm brewing in her eyes, a mixture of emotions that I hadn't expected: fear, desire, and an almost palpable regret. I saw it all in that one look. The internal struggle she had been fighting, the confusion, the guilt of crossing a line she never meant to cross. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, not sure if I was pushing too hard or if I was finally letting her know how deeply I felt. I didn't ask for this either, I said, my voice rough. But I can't ignore it anymore. I know this is wrong, but I don't want to walk away from it. Not when I feel like this. For a moment, she said nothing, just staring at me, her chest rising and falling with every breath. Then, slowly, she took a step toward me. Her hand reached out, brushing against my arm. A touch that felt like a promise and a question all at once. I don't know what we're doing, she whispered, her eyes searching mine for an answer. But I can't walk away from it either. In that moment, everything between us shifted. There was no more denial, no more pretending. The barrier that had once separated us, the professional distance we had maintained, was gone. And what was left was raw, vulnerable, and uncharted territory. We'll figure it out, I said, the certainty in my voice surprising me. I wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line that neither of us could uncross. And somehow, despite the uncertainty, I was okay with that. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was filled with understanding, with the weight of everything we had just confessed to each other. And even though we didn't know what would happen next, we both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like they were suspended in time, caught between the rawness of our confessions and the uncertainty of what we were supposed to do next. Neither of us had the answers, but we couldn't ignore the bond that had formed between us. The weight of our unspoken desires and vulnerabilities hung in the air, making every glance, every brush of hands, more intense than it had ever been before. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But what did that mean for us? I was both terrified and exhilarated by the possibility of what could happen next. I had never imagined finding myself in a situation like this, standing on the edge of something so powerful, so uncontrollable. Yet, even with all the fear that came with the unknown, there was a quiet certainty deep inside me. I knew, somehow, that this was something worth exploring, even if it meant stepping into uncharted territory. Our interactions in class became laced with a new kind of tension. The way we spoke to each other felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if each word was carefully measured. She wasn't just my teacher anymore. She was a person I had shared something deeply intimate with, and there was a subtle, unspoken understanding between us that made everything feel heightened. Every look, every word, carried more weight, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. But we couldn't stay in this limbo forever. We both knew that. The reality of our situation loomed over us, constantly reminding us of the boundaries we had to face. She was still my teacher, and I was still her student. There were rules we had both knowingly and unknowingly ignored. What would the consequences be if anyone found out? Could we continue to walk this tightrope without falling? One afternoon, after another class, I stayed behind once again. She was finishing up some work at her desk, her back to me as I approached her quietly. I hesitated for a moment before speaking, knowing that whatever came next would set the tone for everything. The truth was, I didn't want to keep pretending that things were the same. I didn't want to stay in this uncertain space where nothing was defined, where everything we shared felt like it could slip away at any moment. When she turned to face me, I saw that familiar softness in her eyes, but it was now tinged with something else, something heavier. She was just as aware of the tension as I was. Neither of us could ignore it any longer. "I think we need to talk about this," I said, my voice low but steady. I felt a tightness in my chest as I spoke, knowing that I was about to push us into new territory, into a place where things couldn't stay the same anymore. She looked at me, her lips parting as if to say something, but she paused. Her hands were clasped together in front of her, her fingers slightly trembling. She was clearly struggling, just as I was, but there was a resolve in her eyes. The hesitation was still there, but so was the willingness to face whatever was coming. "I know," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "I've been thinking about this too, about us." It was like the entire world paused in that moment. Hearing her admit that she had been thinking about this, that she was as caught up in it as I was, sent a rush of emotions through me. I felt the rush of relief that came with knowing I wasn't alone in this, that she was willing to face the reality of what was happening between us. But I also felt the weight of the consequences, the knowledge that what we were doing could unravel everything if we weren't careful. "I don't know what this is," she continued, her gaze never leaving mine. "But I can't keep pretending that it's not real. We can't keep pretending that this doesn't matter." Her words, spoken so simply yet with so much depth, made everything feel even more complicated. How could we continue when we both knew what was at stake? And yet, there was something in the way she spoke, in the way she looked at me, that told me we were both ready to take that next step, whatever it might be. "I don't want to hide this anymore," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what it means or what happens next, but I don't want to walk away from it." She stepped closer to me, the space between us closing with a slow, deliberate movement. Her hand brushed mine, just a fleeting touch, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. The contact, brief as it was like a spark igniting something that had been smoldering beneath the surface for so long. "I don't want to hide either," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. There was something raw, something vulnerable in her eyes, and it made my heart ache. "But I'm scared. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we can make this work." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I didn't have all the answers. In fact, I had more questions than anything else. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't ready to walk away. I wasn't ready to let go of whatever this was. It was messy, uncertain, and filled with complications, but it was real, and that made it worth fighting for. "We'll figure it out," I said, the words coming more easily now. "Together." She met my gaze, her lips parting into a small, uncertain smile. And for the first time, it felt like the weight of everything was shared. We didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, we both understood that we didn't have to face it alone. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. And in that quiet, fragile moment, it felt like the beginning of something new. A journey into uncharted territory where nothing was certain, but everything was possible.